Thank you for choosing to join us today for our presentation, Tackling Challenging Greenways. We appreciate having you here, and we're super excited to be with the Georgia Trail Summit again. The purpose of our presentation and the project we want to show to you today is really to highlight how team structure and collaboration can help implement strategies for long-term project vision, fundraising, funding strategies, and solutions for site-specific challenges. We're going to highlight one specific case study that we'll introduce to you shortly, and then relate that to the 26 strategic actions learned that were mentioned in the write-up for this presentation. The design team that I have here with us today is made up of members of Barge Design Solutions, the Trust for Public Land of Tennessee, and the past administrator for the Park Department for the City of Chattanooga. So Jenny Park is the Tennessee State Director for the Trust for Public Land. Larry Zender is with us. He is the past administrator for the City of Chattanooga Parks Department. Ben Nemec is the Director of Quality for Barge Design Solutions and was the civil engineer on the project that we're going to overview for you. And John Brown is Senior Landscape Architect with Barge Design Solutions. And John was the lead designer for the Greenway project. I'm Steve Provo. I'm Vice President with Barge Design Solutions. I'm also a landscape architect and I head our park design and trail and greenway design practice in Georgia. The presentation format is that Larry and Jenny will present to you how they collaborated together to do the upfront planning and funding and community outreach for the project. Ben and John were the lead civil engineer and landscape architect for the project, and will discuss the specific site challenges that we encountered for the project. The project we want to show to you today is South Chickamauga Creek Greenway. It's in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and our first speaker will be Larry Zender, who will give you the background for the project. Larry?
Okay, well, thank you, Steve. We want to get into the plan itself, the 20-year plan, but the plan itself actually started after Walter Cronkite, who was a CBS named Chattanooga as the dirtiest city in America in 1969. That's when all of this started. And it brought the leadership in the city to a point where they decided to emphasize the environmental assets to what we have here in Chattanooga. And we have a beautiful mountain range, we have beautiful river, and of course the Tennessee River flows right through the downtown area of Chattanooga. And they invited me in the late 80s to early 90s to come down to Chattanooga to help them with this effort to build a quality of life environment to Chattanooga. And it all precipitated by this announcement, national announcement, that we had the dirtiest, the crummiest city in America. And as a result, from that initial point, we came back and started analyzing and started looking at the importance of building quality of life to our city. So the Tennessee River was a major asset, and we started the Tennessee River Park, began in the late 80s, early 90s. We also, at that time, started the Greenway emphasis. And from our perspective, we were looking at it from the standpoint of the three major tributaries to the Tennessee River in our area. And that, of course, was the North Chickamauga Creek, the South Chickamauga Creek, and the Chattanooga Creek, which flowed into the Tennessee River. And I felt like at that point, to look at these major corridors of of rivers, that should be a primary feature, primary area for greenways, because it involved the natural resources of the area, but it also involved all the neighborhoods in the area. And so that's how we started. And we had the Planning Commission in 1996 to actually put together a plan involving all these creeks and the areas there, and the development of a Greenway program here in Chattanooga. So with that Planning Commission plan, we started to look at different ways of how we can implement such a thing. And I had a Greenways coordinator working for me, and but we found out that you know, they could only do so much, and they were a government employee. And so what I decided to do was to ask TPL to be under contract with the city of Chattanooga to help me identify properties that could be used and put together conservation easements that could be acquired through this process. And of course, giving to nonprofits is a whole lot better than giving to city governments, because not too many people want to give property to a city government unless there's a big money aspect from that perspective. So we formulated a contract with the Trust for Public Land, and from that point on, we were able to get the conservation easements that were felt like were necessary to build the Greenway program, as well as the Tennessee River Park. So in this process, and because waterways were a natural phenomena of our Greenway program, you have to understand the waterways, they were challenging sites. And so the South Chickamauga Creek was one of those most challenging sites that we had, and that's why we want to feature that as a part of our presentation today. Now, next map, next slide. We want to show you the South Chickamauga Creek itself. And here is the South Chickamauga Creek and the Greenway. And from the left, which is the Tennessee River, it goes all the way through many, many neighborhoods, all the way to another city. So we're not only connecting neighborhoods, we're connecting a city. And that's the city of East Ridge, Tennessee. And so in this format here, you can see how it follows the flow of the water. You can also see that there's a Brainerd levee, which is right in this area, right here. Brainerd levee was built 60 or more years ago as a flood control levee. And we felt like it would be good to make good use of that flood control levee. It had never been used before. And so connecting the levee to the city of East Ridge was a phase of this project. But so the next slide is the implementation challenges that we see, the phasing strategies. We'll talk a little bit about that, and establishing that Greenway corridor and the property easement. But, and then of course the funding. And one of the aspects to funding is to make sure that you have the citizen support that's necessary to support the elected officials in their decisions. And so part of the citizen support, I started a program called You Too Can Canoe, because I wanted the citizens of this area to know where these natural resources were. It was kind of surprising after coming from Virginia down to Tennessee. I found out that a lot of people here didn't know, for example, where my North Chickamauga Creek was. And so I started a program called You Too Can Canoe, which is based on a book that was written in 1977. And I had over 400 people taking part in this canoe program during that summer. And what it did was it brought citizens to the areas, including the South Chickamauga Creek, that they were able to see the beautiful natural surroundings that we had in the city. And it was kind of interesting that an outsider had to point this out to those people who lived here 20, 30 years. And it was a very good part of the implementation strategy, because it gave the elected officials the support from the community to do what is necessary. And so if you want to change the next slide. And the phasing that we took, why do we put this into a phasing thing? Well, if we were to look at the 9 miles of South Chickamauga Creek Greenway as one piece, it would be, to many people, it would seem like a not possible project. But why we phase it? Because it breaks the project into more manageable pieces. The property rights and negotiations do take time, and that's something that by breaking it up, it does help. The availability of public and private money and neighborhoods that that will be going through, those are where you get your support, and identify the key terminus points to the public right of way and the trailhead destination. And one of the things that we found, that you can't do it all at once, and so starting at the beginning point and maybe the ending point and doing a small section of Greenway, more people are able to come and participate. And once you finish a small section, it suggests that success breeds success. And in essence, the general public has the opportunity of coming out there, using it, and you know what they say to their elected officials? Hey, we need to continue this. We need to go to East Ridge, the plan, and get this done. And so that's part of the support and implementation that we felt like was important, and that's why we do the phased approach. There's a lot more that I could say about this, but at this point, I think that gives you a background to our process. And now we get into the real issues like funding and the dealing with the challenges that are going to be faced.
Thanks, Larry. So our next speaker is Jenny Park with the Trust for Public Land. Jenny and her organization work very, very closely in collaboration with Larry and his department in the city of Chattanooga. And Jenny is going to highlight the importance of funding strategies that were put into place and the community partnerships that were formed in order to progress this project along. So, Jenny?
Thanks, Steve. So like with any infrastructure project, construction requires funding. And as Larry mentioned, this project was incremental, and that was beneficial in that it let us break this project into manageable pieces over time and generate community interest. But that incremental approach also created some challenges. Next slide. So we know that this Greenway is really important. South Chick Greenway will be 12 miles once complete. We had a 3-mile gap to finish, and going into the campaign to raise the money for the final gap, we expected there to be a lot of enthusiasm for finally finishing this decades-long project. What we found was that there was some enthusiasm. There was also quite a bit of donor fatigue. And so what that said to us as the entity who was raising about half or a little bit more than half of the funding needed to complete the remaining sections is that we had to think about this Greenway today and what it means in the present context in Chattanooga. Next slide. First, we decided, we've got to figure out how to actually divide up the work on this project. So there were 3 miles remaining. Of those miles, John and Ben will tell you a bit more about design challenges associated with each, but Each section actually has pretty different characteristics, and also we're eligible for different sources of funding. And so Trust for Public Land partnered with the city to divide up the remaining 3 miles into 4 distinct projects. And the city took 3 of them on and leveraged both city funding and state and federal funding to complete. And we took on the middle mile that was also significantly more expensive than any of the others. We call it the Cromwell Connector. And we raised the bulk of money through private philanthropy. This over $5 million project was a significant challenge to raise funding for because it was just so much capital for a project that had been underway for such a long time. And it took us over 4 years to raise the money because we actually did the campaign in 2 separate phases. So I'm going to talk about the final phase of this, where we raised about $2.5 million to finally complete the last mile of the Greenway and some strategies that we used. Next slide. So first, we looked at the mile, the Cromwell Connector that we were building actually would connect a public housing community called Cromwell Hills into the overall Greenway system. So South Chickamauga Creek flows directly behind this housing community of 400 people. And yet they've never been able to connect to the creek because there's no access. So we knew right away that the Greenway, as it connected to people, was a really important part of how we talked about this project, and also how we actually connect with the residents who will eventually use it. So Cromwell Hills, this is a quote from the community center manager of Cromwell Hills. This neighborhood is completely surrounded by industrial use. There are high-speed roadways, no sidewalks, and it's really a challenge for people to live there with limited transportation options, much less recreation. So this Greenway will serve double duty for them in giving them connections to things like grocery stores, but also being able to enjoy the nature that surrounds them. Next slide. So in addition to going to our longtime partners with local foundations, as well as individual donors, we decided to also engage the broader community in this campaign. So whether somebody could get $10 or $1,000, we wanted to give them an opportunity to contribute to this Greenway that has meant so much to people over the years. So one strategy we used was to create an online crowdfunding site where Greenway users could donate online, and if they wanted, they could leave a comment about why they chose to donate. And what we found is that in addition to raising, $13,000 in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge amount of money, but that $13,000 and the comments that people left about how important and how excited they were really inspired major donors to up their giving and to commit, because they saw that community buy-in. So these are just a couple of quotes that we got from the campaign. We had over 70 individual donors. We also promoted the crowdfunding campaign with little signs on the Greenway, letting Greenway users know that this Greenway would be connected in 2021 and that they could donate online, and we saw some good results from that. Next slide. And then a final strategy was using the fact that Trust for Public Land had begun working in Chattanooga in 1994. This was in 2019. We realized 25 years. We need to celebrate all of the work that TPL has been able to accomplish with our partners, such as City of Chattanooga, such as Lyndhurst and Benwood Foundations, and other longtime individual supporters, volunteers, and donors. And so we held a small, pretty inexpensive event to just celebrate all of the amazing things that we have seen happen in Chattanooga because of that partnership. We had about 70 people attend that event, and leading up, in the hours leading up to the event, we found out that, we still had $275,000 left to raise, but a few of our really key longtime supporters who had not contributed yet were absolutely determined to help us get there and close the gap so that this event could be a true celebration of finishing the Greenway, finishing this legacy project of the Trust for Public Land in the city of Chattanooga. And so actually at the event, we had 3 people who came up and made commitments for the $275,000 that was left. And it was a wonderful, emotional night for everyone because we had finally accomplished this thing that we have been working on with so many people for the last several years. Next slide. So those were some strategies on raising money, and I'm happy to answer more questions during the Q&A. But I did want to mention another challenge that is ongoing is keeping the community involved in the Greenway, making sure that it's actually being used. We hear really frequently from our donors. They want to make sure that if they're contributing to something, that it's actually playing the role in the community that we expect it to. So one small strategy that we executed last year was starting a program in partnership with Outdoor Chattanooga, a local quasi-governmental organization that improves outdoor access through programs. We started a program called Outdoor Ambassadors that equips mostly young, some older members of different communities across Chattanooga who wanted to engage in the outdoors but didn't necessarily have the training or skills yet to do so. So they may not know where to hike or bike or canoe or how to even access equipment to do that. So we did a program with them and graduated about 10 outdoor ambassadors, and part of their training was discovering the South Chickamauga Creek Greenway. And this is a photo of 2 participants along with our program manager in the middle. Next slide. So in addition to these strategies that we've just discussed, there are a lot of design challenges that the team had to work through in the course of the project. And so currently there are 9 miles of the Greenway that are accessible. And those are the 3 segments that we talked about earlier, and Ben and John will talk about design aspects of those in more detail. And then these three projects of construction are still remaining. They actually got divided into 4 projects because of city funding reasons. And so all of this to say that funding strategies can be really complicated. You have to be really creative. I'm very grateful that City of Chattanooga was such a good partner in this process, and Barge really helped us think through how we could divide and conquer this 12-mile Greenway. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Steve.
Thanks, Jenny. What Larry and Jenny just described to you show how the collaboration between their organizations to link high-level vision and planning effort with fundraising and community outreach. Another portion of the collaboration on this team, and what was important, was the strong collaboration between the project landscape architect and the project civil engineer, both. So that's Ben Nemick and John Brown with Barge Design Solutions. They're going to discuss how their approaches to the site challenges actually drove the outcomes of the Greenway design in general overall. So here's John Brown. He's going to speak to you about some of the site-specific issues and challenges that they had on site. John?
Thank you, Steve. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So as Jenny mentioned, we have the Greenway is about 9 miles, and these are some of the main kind of highlights that are along that 9 miles. We had 3 covered railroad underpasses, 3 pedestrian bridges, and 6 trailheads. And one of the things that we like to do when we're approaching a design of a Greenway like this is you know, each Greenway has their own challenges, but we take the design philosophy that challenges are create opportunities for better design, and a lot of our most memorable destinations on our Greenways have come from the most challenging parts of design solutions. So this is a listing, kind of a summary of some of the site constraints that we had to deal with on this project. One of the main ones was the steep topography, and you can see this picture on the right. We had steep topography. In some areas it was almost vertical and rocky terrain, and then this presented other challenges as far as construction access. And then we also, as have been alluded to, we had 3 stream crossings, and then we had to deal with railroads and bridges. And then since we're next to the creek, we obviously had floodway and floodplain issues that we'll get into some specifics about. And then natural resources as far as wetlands and streams that we had to deal with as far as permitting and design. So we also had issues during construction, and a lot of that was revolved around construction access. We do have the Greenway corridor. Once it's established, it only has certain points where it actually touches public right of way, which means that you have limited access to get to the site to build the Greenway, and then also to get your material delivered to the site. And then we had some areas in this Greenway where we were over a half a mile to be able to get from our access point to the where we were trying to build the Greenway. So that presents challenges. And then of course we have construction easements that are required from adjacent property owners. Actually, one kind of funny story, when we started this one portion of the project, we were having trouble getting access down to the bridge crossing that we were going to build, and we actually worked with the landowner to give a temporary construction easement, and the property owner had a gravel driveway at the time, and we really needed a paved access, so we were able to give the owner a paved driveway as part of the project that served as our construction access during the project. So anytime you can create shared kind of public-private partnerships like that, it works out great. And then of course the rail crossings create their own challenges, and every Greenway that I've ever worked on seems to have rail crossings. So we'll go through a couple of those particular issues that we've dealt with. So as I mentioned, this was a picture from depicting the steep and rocky terrain that I mentioned, and this particular area was one where we had to go through some boulders and around we had some large mature trees that we were trying to work around, and this guy standing on this rock is actually one of the contractors. And it's funny, they made it clear to us through the whole process that this was a very challenging site, and actually they had one period during the middle of the project where they called a meeting on site and had the meeting on this rock, and they actually had a rappelling rope where they made everybody rappel down to it. So we all knew how hard the project was from what the contractor, how he set that meeting up. But anyway, some of the slopes, as I said, are vertical with the rocks, but we also had some areas where there was a 30-foot vertical drop in a 10-foot width of the Greenway, so that made for some challenges. So when the solutions that we analyze when we have these steep terrain issues, there's a couple different alternatives that we look at. The first and usually the least expensive option is to grade out the site to where we can fit the Greenway in there. That's usually the cheapest way to go, but unfortunately on this site, if we graded out the path, we would lose a lot of mature trees, and it was so steep there was no way for us to catch back the slope before we hit the bottom. So that was not an option on this one. Then the next option is we look at retaining walls, and retaining walls, as long as you can keep them relatively short, that they can be a viable option. Unfortunately, in order to get it through here, we would have had to have some 20-30 foot retaining walls to be able to build this. So the option we ended up looking at and actually moving forward with was an elevated boardwalk system. So next slide.
Hey, John, I was going to add that if you have a site like this one with very difficult site conditions, it'd be important to have a pre-construction or a pre-bid meeting, a mandatory pre-bid meeting. A lot of times your plans will not provide enough evidence to a contractor on the difficulty of the site. You want to make sure that they're on the same page with you prior to construction.
Good point, Ben. So the system that we decided to solve a lot of the grading issues with was an on-deck boardwalk system, on-deck construction. And Ben's going to go into some of the details of this, but you can see that this was actually two different applications of an on-deck boardwalk. The boardwalk on the left was actually a later phase and you can see some differences in the railings here. Actually, the one on the left is the preferred option. It's more open with kind of a we call it a hog wire rail with trimmed out in wood. It gives more open feel. And then the one on the right was more of a parallel wood railing system. The one on the right is actually, it ended up being less expensive, so that's the reason they went with that on that particular option. So next slide. So some of the pros and cons for the boardwalk system. As I mentioned, the boardwalks will allow for minimal impact to the existing terrain and allow for the ability to save more of the existing trees in the forest. It also allows to have an ADA accessible slope with minimal grading. And then Ben's going to go through this on-deck construction, but it also allows for delivery of materials along the length of the boardwalk because of the on-deck construction. The cons are, the biggest con is the cost of it. The cost of the boardwalk is 10 to 12 times as much as a concrete walk at grade. So we're typically looking at $600 to $700 a linear foot for a 10-foot boardwalk system. And then the other thing is that since this is built in 10-foot sections, as Ben will go through, it ends up taking a fairly long time to construct. And then the other con is you do have long-term maintenance associated with the boardwalk system where you have to stain it every 5 or 6 years, and you do have to replace boards from time to time. So next slide. And Ben's going to talk to you about the specifics of this boardwalk system.
Yeah, so this is a typical section of the boardwalk that we had on our plans for each phase of the construction. We did not provide a full design of the boardwalk system. This is usually accomplished by a specialty contractor. And so we provided a performance basis for the installation of the boardwalk. We provided the standard dimensions, the loading, the end characteristics of what we wanted it to look like. And then we go out for bid, and then they provide a certified shop drawing by a registered structural engineer on the product before it's installed. But one of the main performance items that we spec is the on-deck construction. Otherwise, the contractors wouldn't have familiarity with that particular construction methodology, and it was required in order to accomplish the boardwalk work on the terrain for this project in particular. Next slide.
Well, and before you move on, as you look at that, well, you can see it here too. I was going to point out that this piling method of the on-deck construction allows for really you just have the impact of the width of the boardwalk plus the actual where the piles are going in the ground.
Right. So John's point there is that we're able to establish a corridor within an easement of the property, but allow the contractor to wiggle the boardwalk system through the woods, install their pilings at locations where they can actually get depth and refusal. It gives them some flexibility during construction, but also minimizes impact and reduces the impact to the trees, the large trees on the project. But you can see the on deck construction and the way it's built. They use a track hoe or a track piece of equipment. They reach out and they often pre-auger a hole when there's rock, like there was on our project, and then they use a vibratory roller to drive the pile down. And they do this in 10-foot segments. So an average production rate on our projects here in our topography and geology was about 30 foot a day. So you can take your length of boardwalk in that case, divide it by 30, and know you're going to have that many work days to complete a project. So most of our phases, since they were more than 3,000 linear feet of boardwalk, were 9 to 12-month projects. Next slide, please. Here's another picture of the on-deck construction. So I can tell you that after we specified and we got the contractor on board, I was amazed at their skill and blown away when I had seen what the information I put on the plans and what was resulting in the field from that. It was a pretty awesome feat by the contractor on this project.
But you can see how close we can get with the trees through there, and we're able to save most of the trees on the slope.
One of the things that we wanted to point out, in addition to this construction and design solution, was that in addition to those, the breathtaking terrain on this site of the corridor, the primary asset there on South Chickamauga Creek Greenway is the creek itself, which resulted in a number of stream crossings, and it was just turned out to be yet another design challenge and construction challenge that Ben's going to talk to you a little bit about right now. So, Ben?
Next slide, please. Okay, so for the 12.5-mile segment of South Chickamauga Greenway, there were 3 major crossings of the South Chickamauga Creek. They all occurred at different timelines in the project construction over the course of the last 20 plus years. The first stream crossing was the Camp Jordan Bridge, which connected Camp Jordan Park to the levee. And we'll go next slide. So these are some pictures of that bridge. Larry Zender was involved in the Parks and Recreation at that time, and it was offered up to them that they could actually obtain a bridge from Walker County, an older bridge that they were using for maintenance road access to one of their facilities. They needed another bridge, so there was actually a swap that occurred between Walker County, Georgia, and Hamilton County, Tennessee. And this bridge was installed. It was the perfect length for the span, and so that was kind of a unique idea for repurposing a bridge on the project. Larry, do you have anything else to add on that?
No, I think that pretty well explains it. I think we just have to look at different ways of maybe saving money. And having a bridge that wasn't being used, it made sense that we'd move it over there and see if we could put it in place and make use of something that wasn't being used before. So it was a good opportunity, and both cities benefited.
Thanks, Larry.
Sure.
All right, next slide. So this is the second bridge. This is part of the phase 1 project, and this is at Bonnie Oaks. Initially, we were looking at the routes of the Greenway in this area, and the plan was to utilize the existing roadway bridge to avoid installing the stream crossing at this location. Well, once we got into that and we started evaluating the structural impacts to the bridge and dealing with the Department of Transportation in Tennessee, it was quickly discovered that the bridge was not going to be an option. We weren't going to be able to revise the structure in order to have a parallel walkway. So we had to change course and install a new stream crossing. Well, in the case of this one, you had several factors affecting it. First of all, you got to deal with flood elevations, look at FEMA requirements and evaluate those and tackle that really quickly in your project. Otherwise, you may fall behind on your permitting regulations. That can take anywhere from 6 months to a year to get something approved through the FEMA process, either a no-rise or a CLOMR or a LOMR on the project. And then you've got foundations. You need to have geotechnical up front. You need to know what you'll be dealing with from a geology. In this case, we had rock, so we had construction access to each side of the creek in order to install the foundations with equipment capable of coring the rock. Clearance issues, we had both the clearance under the roadway bridge, but then the height that was required for floodway. Clearance under the roadway bridge for pedestrian bike, you want an 8-foot minimum, 10-foot preferred. We actually had to go to the minimum height required in order to accomplish the goal of the project. Construction access, John showed you a picture earlier on we had a 50-ton crane. If you go to the next slide, I think we'll see that. Yeah, here's our access and the boardwalk working up to the bridge crossing. You can see the detail of the drawings. In this case, once again, we provide a performance spec for the actual bridge structure, and then we work with them on the foundation system. Next slide. Here you can see the clearance issues underneath Bonnie Oaks and what we had to do to kind of thread the needle through this location in order to get to the bridge. So a lot of site planning and alternative analysis went into finally identifying the correct route for the bridge at this point. Next slide. And here's a 500-ton crane. This is what I was talking about earlier. In order to set a bridge of this size, it's a 140-foot span and it weighed over 100,000 pounds. We even negotiated with the installer that they would not install the wood decking prior to placing the bridge at this location, because that actually lowered the weight enough to allow this size crane to make a single pick and place it across the creek. But the coordination of that access, do you have access to one side of the creek or both sides of the creek, are critical to the design process. Otherwise, you could be left bidding and trying to construct something that's not constructible because you can't get the construction equipment to the project location. Next slide. And this is the final result. One thing that I wanted to mention, if you had seen the permitting list that we had on the very first slide for this bridge, the Coast Guard was included. Because this is a navigable water, we had to provide a letter to the Coast Guard requesting approval for this bridge. They had to advise whether or not the boat traffic that was expected to come up and down this creek in Chattanooga from the Tennessee River could navigate the new bridge heights. So we did gain approval for that and on the other bridge downstream. Next slide. Okay, so this is the third crossing that was installed as part of phase 1B back in 2015, 2016 timeframe. This is a 190-foot span, and therefore it had even a heavier weight and installation criteria for the project. So we had to deal with the abutment system. We had to look at scour for the bridge piers. We had to look at FEMA no-rise for the project. We had to look at accessibility of the boardwalk ramps up to this location. Next slide. So the contractor came up with the idea of delivering the full span with the wood decking on it, in this case, with a barge from the Tennessee River. We're about probably half a mile upstream from the Tennessee River. You can see how narrow the waterway became to get it up to the crossing location. And then they had to have access for two cranes on each side of the river in order to set this bridge. After we had our experience on phase 1, the 140-foot span, we had a lot better idea of how much planning we needed to do for this 190-foot span, and all the access requirements and the installation methodology were somewhat described and determined during the design process. So that's real important. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of unknown costs for your project.
One of the last types of challenges that we wanted to share with you from this particular corridor is the something John Brown mentioned earlier, is the number of rail crossings and dealing with the railroad. So John and Ben are both going to talk to you some about the underpass techniques that we use, the permitting that was necessary, and then the planning for user safety that was taken into consideration for working in and around the railroad area. So Ben, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so don't let the railroad derail your project. That's the message for today. You've got to start your planning on key design issues along the route of your trail, and the rail is obviously a key design issue. So our barge teams got the rail work out in front. We started the approval process specifically on the phase we're working on now. We had 2 underpasses of CSX and 1 of the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum adjacent to a road underpass. So fairly complicated section of the project that's being built as we speak. Next slide. So early on, we started providing some renderings to TPL for their fundraising aspects on this portion of the Greenway to show the intent of these underpasses. You can see there's also a sewer crossing within that same corridor. So we had all these elevations to either go under or over during this portion of the trail. Next slide. So the 3 railroad underpasses, an important part of the Norfolk Southern or CSX coordination is their process and how you deal with that. Initially, they're going to want to enter into a preliminary engineering agreement with the owner. That requires a force account to be established with an amount of money. In this case, we had to set aside $30,000 in a bank account for them to draw on as they reviewed our plans for approval. And then once they do review and approve, you'll enter into a construction agreement, what's called a lease agreement for access within their right of way to build your project and for it to stay there on it and be renewed on an annual basis. So in that case, you enter into a construction agreement, which you again place money into a force account for the railroad team to do review during construction. Typically, that can range up to $100,000 per crossing. So we worked with the contractor to have a specific duration of work within the rail corridors. We didn't want to leave that open-ended so that we could reduce the amount of time and oversight from the rail. So instead of spending $100,000 on flagmen and their engineering reviewers during construction, we reduced that to $30,000 by the contractor having a specific schedule item for that. Also, John's going to show you some of a walkway that we do have covered under the rail, but they're going to ask in any underpass condition to have full width cover to protect the user in any kind of underpass for a rail. So, next slide. And this just shows you some of the topography we were dealing with at these rail underpasses and what it looked like prior to our construction effort and the design difficulties with a crossing in a remote area like this. Next slide. And this is the design drawing for that crossing, showing the detail that we had to go into to gain approval from the rail authority. In this case, this was CSX at this location.
Well, and as this shows, and you'll see in the next picture, this kind of shows CSX wanted us to try. They were worried about us impacting the footing of that existing stone abutment that they have for their bridge. So they had a certain distance that we needed to stay off of, and which led us to a design solution that was kind of unique in a cantilever design where we actually have just supports on the outside on the opposite side of the trail from the abutment. And if you go to the next slide, this is one of those design solutions I think that we turned into an opportunity, and this has actually become one of the most favorite places for people to visit. But this shows the cantilever design, and we used heavy timbers here. Again, we were trying to use it as more of a design opportunity. Since we had to build it, we wanted to make it look good. And so one of the other requirements that CSX had here is they did not want a solid roof structure over this, because they wanted to be able to look up and evaluate the bottom of their bridge structure and their through the canopy that we were creating. So we had actually a half-inch opening mesh that went on the top of this. So next slide.
Yeah, and I will add to that, John, on the last CSX approval we gained, we went with a similar open roof system, and they made us change it to a solid roof system. So when dealing with the rail, expect variability and reactionary design issues that will come up from their reviewers.
And this is just a picture from the creek looking back towards that same cantilever system. Really turned out into a really neat kind of overlook of the creek. Unfortunately, we had to use a lot of riprap to armor that slope because we do have a lot of flow in this creek. But anyway, this was the solution we came up with.
The rail solutions was the last challenge that we wanted to share with you in this corridor, and our team wanted to thank you all for joining us for this session. We're hoping that the takeaway that you get from our presentation include the importance of the planning and funding team for connecting and collaborating on vision, implementation strategy, funding, and community partnership, but then also keeping that ongoing and collaborating with the design and engineering team, and hopefully embracing the site challenges to drive a successful and unique design outcome. What we have put together, our team members, primarily Larry, had developed a list of 26 strategic actions learned during this process. And we have this information available to any of you that would like to see it. Nearly all of these have been discussed during our presentation today. So we can make these available to you upon request. And Larry, did you have anything you wanted to add about the actions learned?
No, I think other than the fact that these are practical applications that we all experience doing the Tennessee River Park and many of the greenways that we developed here in Chattanooga. So I'm sure there's many other things that we could add to this, but this is the first 26.
The first 26. Thanks, Larry. So the next